Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, No Holding Back Administrative Holds, Policies and Practices. My name is Sarah Leibrandt, and I am the Director of Academic Leadership Initiatives at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. This public webinar is part of a series of virtual membership offerings for the Western Academic Leadership Forum and the Western Alliance of Community College Academic Officers, two membership groups that WICHE leads, which helps chief academic officers and provosts in the West share best practices and ideas with each other. This webinar is made possible by the generous support of our many sponsors. The topic of administrative holds has been gaining attention in recent months at the institution, system, state, and federal level. Administrative holds are one way in which institutions can get students to take action and to re-engage with the institution. As we are going to hear from our panelists today, the use of administrative holds is nearly ubiquitous across institutions in the US. The majority of students experience an administrative hold at some point in their post-secondary journey. We're very curious to understand, how do these policies and practices impact student success, especially for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds? I'm thrilled that we are going to hear from four brilliant experts today. And before we begin, I would like to make a couple of announcements. We encourage conversation among participants and panelists, and so feel free to use the chat feature. Please introduce yourself to the group and to our panelists. Please put any questions in the Q&A box. The webinar is going to be recorded and posted to WICHE's website. Early next week, you will receive an email with the recording and a link to a short survey. I want to recognize our sponsors: Academic Search, Art and Science Group, Cambridge Assessment International Education, College Board, MC Burning Glass, Mentor Collective, Open Syllabus, AACRAO, and Quotely, whose support is making our 2022 offerings to the Forum and Alliance possible. I also want to thank Ascendium Education Group and Lumina Foundation for their generous funding for new projects that WICHE is launching in collaboration with the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Missions Officers to help members of the Alliance and Forum use institution data to better understand their administrative holds, policies, and practices. And we'll share more information about this grant opportunity at the end of the webinar. Today, I am joined by four experts to share their findings related to administrative holds. Bryan Dickson is the Director of Student Financial Services and Education Programs with the National Association of College and University Business Officers. James Ward is a Senior Researcher with Ithaka SR. Mary Fulton is a Senior Policy Analyst with Education Commission of the States. And Wendy Kilgore is the Director of Research for the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. And so with that, we'll go ahead and turn off the presentation, and I will open my first question to our panelists. Please tell us a little bit about your organization and your interest in understanding administrative holds and policies and practices. Wendy, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. A little technical difficulties there. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for having us here. As you mentioned, I'm with the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. And the use of student administrative success holds is kind of near and dear to the registrar's role, which is our primary membership. And so we have wanted to understand how the impact of those holds affects students' ability to continue on either at the institution they're currently in by being able to register for the next term, or being able to take their credits and go elsewhere to get a job or go on to graduate school or transfer institutions. So it's been a long-term process for us in understanding it, several years in trying to understand this data and get the benchmarking in practice.
That's great. Not everyone jumped in at once, but I open it up to you, Mary and James and Bryan, to share a little bit about your work.
So, as I said, I'm Mary Fulton with Education Commission of States, and we work with and connect state leaders and policy leaders and education leaders from across the country to kind of learn from each other and to improve or kind of inform their decisions. And our work usually focuses on research, which includes tracking state actions from early learning through workforce development, producing research, policy reports and resources, and providing advice to and connecting state leaders. So we received a generous grant from Ascendium Education Group to develop a more nuanced understanding of the origins of administrative holds that are placed on student records. And the thought was that a better understanding of holds may support more informed discussions and strategic decisions about the impact of holds on students and the trade-offs on a broader student success agenda and possible reforms to practices and policies. And to accomplish these goals, we reviewed the recent reports and research, mostly by the folks on this webinar, to gain better understanding of the use and intent of administrative holds. We conducted a preliminary review of recent state legislation and existing state policies. And we contracted with SOVA Solutions to explore policies and practices, which included state interviews. And through this project work, we produced an internal strategy brief for Ascendium and an external policy brief for ECS audiences.
I'll jump in. Bryan, Dickson, Director of Student Financial Services Educational Programs at NACUBO. That's the National Association of College and University Business Officers. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invite, Sarah. NACUBO, as I said, we represent college and university business officers. We've actually been around. We're about to celebrate our 60th anniversary this year. And our mission is to advance the economic vitality, business practices, and support of higher ed institutions in pursuit of their missions. And we do that through advocacy, education, research, and professional development. And in terms of the topic today and holds, within the business office, you have the chief financial officer, and we have tax professionals, controllers, accountants, student accounts, the bursar's office. And we think, okay, student accounts, this is where the business office meets students, intersects with students. And it's actually kind of one of the unique areas within the business office. And we're going to describe, and Wendy and others are going to describe some research. And as we think about the different types of holds that are placed on students and how some of those are indeed tied to a balance owed to the institution, obviously there is an interest from the business office there, and not just solely because of the dollars and cents involved, but and we'll get into this, I think, in our discussion here, Sarah, a little bit down the line. But we too want to make sure that folks, everyone at an institution, is thinking about holds and is looking at the entire picture. And as we're going to talk, there are tons of offices, policies, and reasons and rationale involved here. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and my organization is coming from, and we are thrilled to be a part of the conversation today.
Great, and I'm James Ward. I'm a senior researcher with Ithaka SNR. Ithaka SNR is a nonprofit research and advisory organization focused on improving opportunities and equity in post-secondary education. We've been working on the issue of stranded credits for the past few years with some very generous support from Lumina Foundation, the Joyce Foundation, and now the Kresge Foundation. And we really got into this because of its relationship to opportunities in post-secondary education. And the issue of stranded credits is a potential barrier to students pursuing their credential and earning a degree. So we knew that there are now 39 million students with some college and no degree. We knew a subset of those were, not able to enroll because of unpaid balances to institutions and the subsequent holds that come with them. So we've really been working on trying to better understand the issue and the scope of the problem, as well as come up with some proactive solutions that are going to lower those barriers for students.
That's great. Thank you all for taking the time to introduce yourself and your organization's perspective or interest in administrative holds. So my next question, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the research or initiatives that your organization has undertaken. What questions were you trying to address, and what findings most surprised you? Wendy, would you like to go?
Sure, because it kind of we're overlapping. So James is gonna, work with James. I'm gonna let him focus on the stuff that we partnered with his organization on, and step to the next couple of phases. We wanted to get a deeper dive into understanding the what institutional efforts are used to collect debt that result in the inability for the student to continue in the next term or to get their transcript, or both at the same time. What is the volume of holds? Like, what percentage of students receive holds that stop them from receiving a transcript and moving forward over a course of an academic year or two? What is the average dollar amount? So we really wanted to dive into that information, and whether or not there were any particular student populations that were inequitably affected by this data. And so we did two approaches for that. One, we did a benchmarking study for national practices. Several hundred institutions responded to that. And then we also had 14 institutions that we took the data, the actual data from them, the whole data, and massaged it and looked at it and tried to get some information from that. What was most surprising about that data is that we were finding that nationally, 49% of institutions will hold back a transcript for any dollar amount owed that's greater than zero. So quite literally, 50 cents, anything greater than zero, they will stop a transcript from moving forward. What was a little less surprising, because of the nature of our understanding of our membership, is that 95% use transcript holds and 99% use registration holds. But the interesting part is they're almost always at the same time. So if they place a hold, it's a hold that does both stopping registration and withholding the transcript. We also found that a little bit surprising that the registrar really isn't the one who places all these holds. It's actually outside of the registrar's office, predominantly tied to student success and accounts payable. One of our, in the group study of institutions, one of our members made this great statement, and I loved his, because his most surprising takeaway, and I'll just read his quote, is, "My takeaway from the study is that our practice regarding holds, why they are imposed, on whom, how the target student is notified, and the content of that notification in terms of resolution actions are often less than transparent to those most at risk of experiencing the hold as a stop sign rather than a yield." Because, and that's just really encapsulates what we found. These practices are intended to, most of the time, to resolve an issue that the student must address. They must pay a bill that they owe. They should see an academic advisor. They should go to financial aid to make sure that's lined up. So the purpose of the hold is meant to motivate a student to take an action, usually in a positive way. So they're not sent to collections, or they can register for classes appropriately and be advised. But that the way the institutions communicate it and the technology used to communicate that is often limited to 32 characters and a hold code on their portal is confusing. So while almost all students get holds, we found about in our population, 84% of all students, of 300,000 plus students in this sample, had one or more hold placed on their record over the course of the data. So it affects almost every student, but the way we communicate it is probably less than clear to a certain population that doesn't have the cultural capital of understanding what those holds are used for. So that's the main key takeaways right now.
I think before we jump in to hear from the rest of you all, we have a question here, and Wendy, and others, maybe you can address it, especially since you said that the whole dollar amount that you found, Wendy, was quite low. So the question in the Q&A is, in your opinion, what is considered minor debt, which would not have a hold?
I see Wendy looks to be smiling to me as representative from the business office here, and it's a good question, and it's a really tough question actually, because and I know this might not be the answer you're all looking for, but it really depends. Minor at one institution, I could give you, a dollar amount, a percentage amount, or something like that for one institution, and that might be totally unreasonable for another institution. And similarly, that amount might be reasonable for one student at that institution and might be unreasonable for a different student at that institution. And I know that makes it really hard as we're thinking about policies and what to set, but I think we're going to get into a little bit of a conversation a little further here about kind of all of those factors to consider as you're thinking about what is minor, what is trivial. I know we've used the word trivial as well. What does that mean for us, for our institution? And taking and trying to apply a one-size-fits-all approach is really going to be difficult. And as Wendy and I will talk, and others about a joint statement we worked on and some other initiatives, that was not what we were going for. We did not want to prescribe any kind of solution. So I'm sorry, that's probably not the answer that the person questioning us was hoping for, but we hope to explain why its complicated answer is what it is.
Wendy, you want to jump in?
Thank you, Bryan, for taking that on. I can give you a little bit. Some institutions in this sample who investigated their policies and practices used a rubric at the end to say, for them, and again, practices differ from institution to institution, but for them, if the debt was less than the tuition for a 3-semester credit hour course, perhaps that was their threshold, and they decided not to place holds at that value. And others set the value a little bit higher, and others said, no, we're going to go ahead and lower it to just some rent, some 500 or something. But it, as Bryan explained, the practice varies a lot, and for good reasons at many institutions.
Thanks. Keep these questions coming to all of our attendees. But Wendy or Mary, I would love to turn over to you to hear a little bit about the research that you all did at ECS and what findings surprised you.
Right. So at least to start, I'll bring it up to a higher level on the state policy front, because we were trying to answer two primary questions. Who is the authority to place administrative holds, and where in state and post-secondary system and institutional policies does this authority derive? And then also to look what we've talked about, to what extent do holds create barriers to student success for completing a post-secondary education or pursuing careers? And in terms of state policies, what we found, at least preliminarily, is these policies exist in several different sections in state statute, some of which have nothing directly to do with post-secondary education. Maybe they're more broadly about debt collection. And some of these important policies, are really under the purview of system or institutional boards. So they're a lot harder to track down because there's not really a good, search system. We can do that a little more easily at the state level. So there's a lot of activity at that system and institutional level, that I think, Wendy's, group and others can kind of, I think surface. That's a little harder for us. And even the different language and terms that are used also made it really hard to kind of track down some of these policies or to understand them, especially if they were kind of tucked outside of the education area. But we also do know that these policies exist at the state and system and institutional level, and they may allow or limit or prohibit the use of holds. And to Wendy's points in the data that her group found, so most of these recently enacted and proposed policies primarily focused on transcript holds. and then maybe secondarily on registration holds. And several things surprised us about this project. First of all, we thought administrative holds was going to be a straightforward, narrowly focused topic. And very quickly it became apparent that this topic is complicated, it's nuanced, and it's multifaceted. And I think most of us who have worked on this issue have discovered that. So we thought like, oh yeah, we can figure this out, and not so true. Bringing it down to a little more on the institutional level, and I think, Bryan and Wendy have kind of alluded to this. One thing that really surprised us was the number of the different types of holds that institutions have and the extent to which they're spread across so many different departments. And this can lead to a lack of comprehensive data on the number and dollar amounts of holds, the reasons for holds, the number and types of students who are issued holds, the impact on their success, and the effectiveness of holds for their intended purpose. I think it's hard, just that communication when you have so many departments, and then especially when you bring in the system level, or when you're trying to communicate up to the system level, and then even to the state level. So it's when you have that disbursement of information, it's a little tricky. And a couple last points, and I think Wendy also alluded to this, and this came through our state interviews, that a lot of institutions see holds as a way to connect with students, and support them and help them complete a credential. Yet, far less is known about the actual implications for students, even if their situation's resolved. For example, some students may pay off their debt, yet they might stop out or drop out, for financial reasons. So just because it's resolved, we really don't know some of the outcomes of that situation.
Thanks so much, Mary. James, as you've listened to that, can you talk a little bit about the work that you all have undertaken at Ithaka SNR and some findings that have surprised you all?
Sure. So our initial goal with our research was to really understand the scope of the problem. So we triangulated data from IPEDS, from NACUBO Student Financial Services survey. So thank the good folks at NACUBO for putting that out every year. And then some other sources to try to come up with institution level estimates of the number of students who have stranded credits and what these unpaid balances look like at the institution level. So when we put our report out, our first report out in 2020, we estimated that roughly 6.5 million students had debts, and these debts were totaling more than $15 billion. So certainly not an insignificant problem by any means. In follow-up work, we've looked across states, and we've seen quite a bit of variation across states, depending on the mix of institutions at the state, as well as the tuition levels amongst those institutions, especially amongst publics. I think what was most surprising for us, something that Wendy has mentioned, was the fact that institutions were willing to hold for really small balances. Talking about as low as $25 in some cases. We also were surprised with the variation across campuses in our estimates. So, the average balance that we found at community colleges was about $600, meaning that there are a lot of students with relatively small balances who may be hung up and not able to kind of re-enroll or move forward with their education. And our second phase of work has really been focused on trying to proactively solve this problem and address it. Which comes with, more research for sure. So we launched the Ohio College Comeback Compact earlier this year with 8 institutions in Northeast Ohio. It's a mix of public 2- and 4-year institutions. And the compact provides debt forgiveness for students. It allows them to re-enroll at any of the participating institutions. And it also provides a mechanism for cross-subsidization for these returning students. So we'll be conducting a full-scale evaluation of this and contributing to a better understanding of the problem and really digging deeper into who is experiencing this issue and the barriers that they're facing as they re-enroll. And we're also open to sharing new partners new partnerships if anyone is interested in kind of mimicking this model or expanding this approach.
Thanks, James. I'm really excited to see what the work in Ohio unfolds. Bryan, do you want to talk a little bit about how this conversation is resonating with you and some of the work that you all have been doing?
Yeah, actually, this kind of ties this all together. You know, looking at and thinking at the work that Wendy, James, and Mary have cited. You know, Wendy and I, at least in AACRAO and NACUBO, had started some conversations late last year about this, and just thinking a little bigger than our organizations and kind of what this looks like. And that was the start for this joint statement that I had mentioned, and I think some links have been dropped into the chat for attendees on that as well, because we realized that kind of what we're asking for in the statement was what we need to be doing together as a higher education community, is coming together and talking through this issue. So we came up with we put together some language in a joint statement that we released back in April. And again, wanted to really emphasize that these are tools that institutions have, but also to make sure that we're using these tools appropriately, and that we're thinking about how we use these tools. And I think I really like the yield sign versus stop sign. I think that's a really good analogy here to think about. And as we, and we'll talk a little more about some of the points made in the statement and recommendations for institutions, but one of the things too we do want to avoid, and I think Wendy had mentioned, collection agencies and all of the trouble that can come from there, referring student accounts down those avenues, but also some of these pressing pause versus stop, yield versus stop. If a student is in a situation where there might be something causing this hold, and especially if it's a financial reason, maybe pressing pause to figure out what's going on there, rather than allowing that to balloon to where it really starts to get out of control. So also thinking about, let's sit down and talk here, so that we're not, we may be talking today about a debt of $800 versus, for example, next year something that's closer to $2,500. That's that much harder to work through. So that's why we call for institutions, to be able to use these administrative process holds and these student success holds, but within some of the guidelines that we mentioned in our statement. And one of the key things is to review these policies. They have been sitting for some institutions on the shelves for quite some time, and to take them down off the shelves, take a look, dust them off, bring in relevant folks to talk through them and take a look. Who are they impacting? Why are they impacting? What are the resolution percentages, and why aren't certain holds being resolved? But also too, and I think this is the bigger challenge, and we make a point in the statement to talk about really effectively communicating with students before, during, and after a hold is placed. But the question always is, well, how do we communicate? What are we communicating? And that's another challenge that sometimes is very unique to specific institutions, because folks on this call now probably know better how to communicate with their enrolled students than any one of us on this panel could ever dictate to them. We can make recommendations, but your students. You may know what works. You may probably know more of what doesn't work. But sometimes in those, there are multiple day-long seminars on how to communicate with students. And I think some folks, again, not to say it's complicated and there are multiple approaches, but there indeed are. So how institutions communicate will be something that they'll need to really think about. But again, before, and I I would say, multiple communications before, certainly during and after, and making sure that we're looking back at what happened to prevent that from going forward. So again, we'll get into some of the particulars of the statement here maybe a little later in the conversation, but at least from the AACRAO NACUBO perspective, that all of this kind of came together and had us realizing, hey, we need to talk about this, and we're really fortunate to have been able to work with AACRAO on this. I don't know, Wendy, if you want to chime in. I see you smiling and nodding, but if you'd like to, please do.
Bryan, well, I thank you for doing the summary. Appreciate that. We very much appreciate AACRAO, appreciates NACUBO partnering with us on this as well. Another reason, and you highlighted it a bit, was trying to also put a resource out there that I see in institutions. How can you encourage senior leaders to adopt debt forgiveness programs for minor or trivial debt? And Mary is talking about pending legislation. This joint statement is absolutely meant to be as a resource to help talk about it at your institution, about best practices or good practices or leading, but also to potentially use with pending legislation to help shape it so it's something that actually does help the students, rather than potentially putting them in an awkward situation, the institution and the students in an awkward situation, by removing a tool that can place the students in a more difficult position, potentially with debt that is unresolved at the institution level and then has to be advanced. So we enjoyed working on it with you, and hope folks embrace it.
We've talked a little bit about students and groups of students. And so I'm wondering if all of you, in the work that you've been doing, have you seen anything or found anything on how administrative hold policies and practices as they currently are, how have they advanced or hindered closing the equity gap for students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, students who don't necessarily have all that cultural capital that they need to navigate through the post-secondary system?
Sure, I'm happy to start this one off. So our data from our research show that the problem is more pronounced at community colleges, which we know serve just a disproportionate share of historically underserved students. So of the total students we estimated, it was more than 3 million students at community colleges had stranded credit. So a pretty substantial problem amongst these students. We also, in our estimates, show that students with higher shares of Pell recipients were more likely to have students with stranded credits, and that students with higher percentages of underrepresented minority students were more likely to have students who were in collections, so kind of the most extreme version of this. We partnered with Dr. Sasanya Jones and Melody Andrews at Howard University on some qualitative research as well, and their research kind of reaffirmed that this is disproportionately impacting students of color. And they also found that first-generation students with stranded credits kind of had less bureaucratic knowledge that could help them address the problem. So going back to what Wendy was talking about, that stop versus yield. And I think it's really hanging up a lot of students who are new to the college experience and don't have that social capital to understand how to address the problem proactively. And I think from our findings and from the qualitative research that Dr. Jones and Melody did as well, it's really important that colleges understand how different groups of students are experiencing the problem, and then think through the solutions that are responsive to those different experiences. And this is something that we're trying to do with the Ohio Comeback, with the Ohio Compact, by taking kind of a student-focused approach. And we're really trying to kind of expand the research around the student experience in this to better understand how it's impacting different populations.
Sarah, if you don't mind. And James and I have talked about this. It's been this interesting conversation about our different data, and I'm not disagreeing with his recommendations that there are potentially pockets of students that are more impacted by this practice than not. Our data it was a sample of institutions. So always put that research caveat. It's only 14 institutions and it's a couple of years of data, but it was student hold data. Our data actually showed kind of the opposite. The student hold data actually showed that the likelihood a student with modest statistical correlations, that the student is more likely to resolve any hold. Sorry, try this again. That a student attending and minority serving institutions are more likely to resolve debt holds than those not attending minority serving institutions. So we found that one finding, but again, small sample. And that we also found that as resolving a hold actually decreases as the percentage of Pell Grant increases at the institution. So that's kind of contradictory data there. And there's a couple of other nuances that were actually statistical among these hundreds of thousands of holds. But the point of that is that the data from Ithaka SNR and our data basically point to the need for more work. That institutions are very different, their practices are different, the populations they serve are different. And so we would advocate, look at your own data. Absolutely, go back, look at it, examine it, and see if your practices and policies and resolution rates of the holds are impacting a particular population more than another, and in an equitable fashion, and then try to address that. Because I think if we keep taking slices of this data around at groups of institutions, we're going to find these results they're going to vacillate a little bit just because of the differences in institutions.
Thanks, Wendy. Mary, before I turn to you and Bryan to answer this question, there's a question in the chat, another definitional question I think would be good to talk about. So does resolving a hold mean that a student manages to re-enroll and complete after, or does it mean paying off the account? I think this question came in, Wendy, as you were talking about your research. So maybe you want to, if you're able to address that, you can. If there's other definitions or that folks want to chime in, please do.
Good question. It actually has a somewhat complicated result. The data, it was challenging for institutions to actually find out whether or not students who had transcript holds were able to transfer to another institution. So the being able to identify a student as successfully transferring was not a viable variable. So we weren't able to take a look at that. Resolving a hold was twofold. That is, the hold was removed from the account, which means just in practice, it was addressed. So the hold was expired, be that the registration hold, a student code of conduct hold, or a billing hold. It was removed and no longer considered an issue. So that's what we ultimately meant by resolved, is the action was taken or addressed. Whether or not they re-enrolled or they transferred elsewhere or they completed, that the data is muddy. That's another one of the challenges, which is why WICHE and AACRAO are engaging in this project now over the next 18 months to try to refine how institutions can look at the data to understand it with a little less cloudiness to it.
Thanks, Wendy. Mary, I think I saw you come off mute at one point. Do you want to address that question and then anything around closing the equity gap?
Well, actually, I was going to turn to Wendy because they've done such great work, and what I have cited was really coming from the folks in on this webinar that we see these high percentages of resolve, like I said, but we don't really know what that means. We don't really understand the implications and the student experience with respect to holds, and I think that's one area certainly that warrants some further research, and it kind of ties to this equity issue, and we've not done that specific research that James and Bryan and Wendy have, yet some of that information is not getting to the state policy level. I think partly because it's new or it's emerging. And so a lot of these state leaders, with very good intentions, are proposing or enacting, some of these policies, or at the system level, without kind of a clear understanding of what does this really mean for students and different groups of students. And so, how in going forward, how we can tie that information to, even if states have enacted policies, we don't know much about how they've been implemented, or kind of the implications of the implementation. So the more good data that can be, I think, presented to state leaders who are proposing or enacted policies, and having that conversation to make sure that they, with their policies, they take a look at the data. Like one of the policies enacted in Washington, they did have, provision that, they have to kind of collect and report some of the data, and a policy that failed in Maryland was really all about data collection, because they recognize that we just don't know enough. So I would encourage, however we can have that conversation, to bring these good findings to that state policy arena would be welcomed and helpful.
Thanks, Mary. Bryan, would you like to jump in and answer this
Yeah,
question?
not much that hasn't already been said. I think Mary makes some great points, and Wendy as well, with institutions do have a lot of data as well. So I won't take up any more time. I would just give 3 nods to my colleagues on the call here for their points that were made.
A question came up in the Q&A that is related to this topic. So from the University of Alaska, Anchorage, they have a large population of Alaska Native students or other students from minority backgrounds. And they struggle to get students to even fill out a FAFSA. So then students are paying as they go, which leads to a longer road to completion. If you add holds on top of the struggle to pay, they see many students just stopping. And so is there a way to do a partial hold or other ways to help students be able to re-enroll?
Take a shot at that one. A couple of the recommendations in the joint statement talk about building in provisions for allowing students to continue their enrollment and or have access to their official transcript, even if there's an outstanding debt in particular that is on their record, but allowing for the students to appeal that and move forward and register for the next term, and putting something in place to counsel them on how to resolve the outstanding debt, maybe finding some unknown financial aid that doesn't require FAFSA, maybe an institutional support or something, but also allowing them to have access to an official transcript if they're trying to transfer to another institution, like specific purpose, get a job, they get employed, they can pay back the debt, or get professional licensure once they've completed their degree, but you're holding onto their transcript, also preventing them from getting a job. So I hope that answers the question, but it's kind of putting these things in place that says, we're kind of putting this hold here, but come talk to us. We have ways around it, where it really is a yield. It's not completely a stop, and just making that very clear.
Thanks, Wendy. So we have a couple of other questions in the Q&A, and before we turn to that, my last question for all of the panelists is, you're speaking to chief academic officers and provosts on the call today. What advice would you have for this group of individuals as they look at their administrative hold policies and practices on their own campus?
I would add we're talking to more than just those audiences. I know who may be registered, but I like to think of it as a conversation across the campus. But as they're making or revising these policies, I would certainly hope they already have policies in place. So I hope they're not starting to think about making policies around this area. That would be a concern right up the top. But in revising these, kind of what I was sharing earlier, Sarah, is first just take them off the shelf and have a look, and look at the data that you have on these holds. How many holds do you have? What offices are placing them? That comment that was made of how many offices have the ability to place these holds, and trying to get that a little more centralized. I recognize there needs to be some flexibility, but not everyone having that kind of universal access. The students for whom the holds are being placed, again, the resolution rates, who aren't those holds being resolved for, and why, and what can we do to address that? But to Wendy's point, she mentioned the ability to appeal, the communications, and really try to think about, well, if we have data that say that this type of hold is really, really, really not working in this space for this action, what are the alternatives too? Because if it's not working, why are we still thinking about this particular approach? And then as we think about holds, specifically tied to dollar amounts, think about potential, debt forgiveness or plans or payment plans. I know that different states, and depending on the type of institution and where you're located, some of these flexibilities you might not be able to include in your policies, but where you can include them, I think adding abilities to appeal is a great start, because at its core, if you're reviewing an appeal, you are listening to a student who is having a challenge with this particular hold. So that just opens up the communications process even more. And at the same time, and as an association representing business officers, folks are often thinking, again, it's dollars and cents, but thinking about, when we talk about trivial amounts and minor amounts, to that question earlier, how is that fitting into our mission as institutions of higher education? And is a $15 hold for this really worth it at the end of the day for X? And again, not saying that that's a $15 hold or where that should come from, but really, I would, to get to the question, if folks are thinking about examining these policies, I would start, and it's the plug for the statement from AACRAO and NACUBO, but it really gets the conversation going on campus, and bring as many folks as you can to the table to have those discussions, would be my ultimate recommendation at the end of the day.
So I would, sorry. I would recommend, institutional leaders really focusing on kind of both sides of the equation. So the work that we're doing directly with institutions is not just addressing the hold, but also addressing the debt. Things like state bans on transcript holding, free up that one part, but that debt is still potentially following those students around and may still end up in collections and could have a lot of long-term consequences for that student. So I think, any solutions that we come up with really need to be focusing on both sides of that equation. And I think institutional leaders need to pay attention to that.
So maybe I'll build on what Bryan and James have said, and maybe bringing it up a little bit. And I don't know, maybe giving a plug to your new project, Sarah, that I would really encourage folks at the system and institutional level to collaborate with each other and with research and policy organizations, because we learn a lot. Wendy's project I think demonstrated when you collaborate, you're going to learn a lot, and also that could help deepen the understanding of the impact on students, especially different student groups, generate more effective approaches to communicating about holds, and ways to provide solutions and support to students. And expand the understanding of the types and effectiveness of some of the debt relief that James just mentioned. And also that, this could help, identify strategies to evaluate, the effectiveness and the implications of admin hold policies and practices, and if necessary, to kind of initiate reform. So I think that builds a little bit on, the NACUBO and AACRAO statement. And lastly, I'd encourage system and institutional leaders to examine the relevant state and system policies and identify any latitude that they may have to reform administrative holds practices. I think we saw that with a lot of the media attention that, once there was kind of this call out of some of these policies, a lot of individual institutions and systems kind of looked at their policies and say, well, we actually have some flexibility that we can start maybe pulling back on some of these holds, or maybe lowering the threshold or raising the threshold rather. So I think there's this, sometimes there is a sense that there's, that they're tied by certain state policies, and that may or may not be true, especially folks within the institution and system have some conversations and maybe even check with state leaders. We've seen Ohio kind of issued some guidelines saying this is when you can relieve some debt to the institution. So kind of roping in that state and system policy and understanding where you have some space to make some reforms, or where there are some constraints that maybe need to be addressed.
Just like to piggyback on Mary's comments here, that if your institution has the ability to influence any developing legislation and policy or guidelines, please do try to engage in those conversations. Anecdotally, by some open-ended responses, we are hearing through various channels that institutions are finding a way around the transcript hold, because the legislation is written in such a black and white way that, okay, we will release a transcript, but does it include the degree? Does it include the grades? Does it include, I mean, it's this very large interwoven puzzle. And I think institutions and legislatures and state level policymakers should just really work together to say what we're actually trying to do here is help students. And let's find a way to do that without trying to find loopholes. Let's find a way to resolve the debt. Let's find a way to get them the job and get them to continue their education.
Thanks, Wendy and Mary and Brian and James. A question came up in the chat around sustainability and the use of HERF dollars. So HERF dollars are coming to an end, and some institutions have been able to use these to forgive holds. And so what opportunities or challenges do you see as institutions need to think about a different and sustainable solution now that those federal dollars are coming to an end?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this. So I think, first of all, understanding what the impact of those HERF dollars were and continue to be is really important. I think it's worth understanding how many students benefited from any forgiveness programs that came out of that expenditure, and if those students are now succeeding. So I think that's an important first step. But in terms of thinking sustainably, I think the Ohio Compact that we're starting at Ithaka is really trying to get at that, right? So because it's a group of institutions, we are trying to create incentives that help institutions recoup some of that money through this cross-subsidization, while also incentivizing them to let students back in and forgive those debts because of the potential future tuition revenue they'll be seeing from those students, right? We also know that students, single institution forgiveness programs are really helpful for a lot of students and have had success, but we know a lot of students aren't necessarily seeking to return to the same institution. Either they have moved or they're looking to start a different program that might not be offered there, or they simply left under circumstances and have this hold and really just don't want to go back to that institution. So I think creating creative solutions that are kind of financially sustainable for the institutions is really important in order to help them open up the doors and really kind of lower the institution's barriers to expanding opportunity for students.
Thanks, James. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in on that question or offer some thoughts? There's a few questions in the Q&A in the chat that we weren't able to get to today. Know that I'm going to share them with our panelists after the call, and we can get back to you with answers. A couple of them came in as anonymous, and so if you want us to follow up, if you don't mind just putting in your name in the Q&A or the chat or sending me a note, I'm happy to reach back out to you. At this time, I want to thank my panelists for such a wonderful conversation, and then spend the last few minutes talking about this new grant that WICHE and AACRAO have received to kind of continue the conversation that we've been having today. So thank you very much, Bryan and Mary and James and Wendy, for your thoughts and your insights today and sharing your work. So the project that we have, that we're embarking upon, is funded by Lumina Foundation and Ascendium Education Group. And we are able to work with a cohort of 12 institutions who are members of the Alliance and Forum to be selected from an application pool to work together over the course of the year. And the work is building on the work that Wendy shared today that AACRAO has done in terms of how do you collect this data across your campus, how do you clean it, how do you compile it and analyze it, to look at the administrative holds and policies and their impact on students. Over the course of the year, this cohort of institutions will get to work together. They'll come together in person in Boulder, Colorado in early August for a workshop to understand what those data elements are and the data sources, and they'll go back to their campus to collect that information. And over the course of the year, we'll work as a community of practice, gathering quarterly virtually to talk about our progress, and then some of those conversations that institutions would start to have as they look at the outcomes of these administrative hold policies and practices, and how can those policies change on campus. So I wanted to let you all know that we will be announcing an RFP for this project 1 week from today on May 25th, and it'll stay open for 4 weeks and then go through June 22nd. Selected institutions would be notified on July 1st, and then that kickoff meeting would take place at the beginning of August. Similar to this webinar where we got to talk about all of the great research that these organizations are doing, we're going to be having a final convening in October of 23, which seems quite far off from now, but it'll be here before we know it, to talk about the lessons learned from these 12 institutions as they've gone through that process. And so we invite all of you to come and to listen and to learn from that. AACRAO will be putting together a technical handbook that any institution would be able to leverage to go through the same exercise themselves without participating in this project. And then WICHE will be conducting focus groups with administrative leaders and staff across multiple departments, as well as students, to learn a little bit more about administrative holds from those various perspectives, and doing case study analysis of the 12 institutions that are participating. And then we'll be publishing that brief at the end as well. But if you have any